We must elect our own delegates now. The officers must decide. I am chosen. We will be heard.
In early 1917, the Russian army stood at the height of its apparent power, with nearly 7 million men under arms, modern rifles finally reaching the front, and artillery stockpiles larger than at any point earlier in the war. It looked, at least on paper, like a force ready to shape the fate of Europe. To allies and enemies alike, the long-feared Russian steamroller seemed poised to roll forward at last. But beneath this impressive surface, something far more dangerous was taking root. For nearly 3 years, the army had been bled white. Entire generations of experienced officers were gone, replaced by exhausted conscripts who had seen too much and believed too little. Trenches stretched endlessly across frozen plains, filled not only with mud and barbed wire, but with doubt. Soldiers fought on, not because they believed in victory, but because they no longer knew how to stop. Back home, their families queued for bread. Prices soared. Trains failed to arrive. Letters from villages and cities spoke of hunger, anger, and despair. The front and the home front were no longer separate worlds, they were collapsing together. And so, in 1917, the Russian army faced an enemy more powerful than German artillery or Austro-Hungarian divisions. It faced the slow death of trust, purpose, and belief. In this documentary, we will explore how the largest army in the world began to unravel from within, how discipline dissolved, loyalty fractured, and millions of soldiers ultimately chose to walk away from the war. If you enjoy in-depth historical storytelling that goes beyond the battlefield and into the human forces that shape history, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you do not miss future documentaries. This is the story of how an army did not fall in defeat but quietly, decisively, fell apart, while the soldiers remained in the trenches, enduring cold, hunger, and endless artillery fire. Another battlefield was collapsing far behind the lines. The Russian Empire's home front, already fragile before the war, began to buckle under the weight of total mobilization. What had once been a distant concern slowly became an intimate and devastating reality for the men at the front. Because the war was no longer something happening somewhere else. It had followed them into every letter, every rumor, and every sleepless night. Before the war, Russia had been a major exporter of grain, and many soldiers came from farming families who believed that, no matter how hard life became at the front, their homes would survive. By 1917, that belief was gone. Fields lay untended because millions of young men were in uniform or buried in foreign soil. Harvests shrank, and what food remained often never reached the cities or the army. The railway system, stretched beyond its limits by military transport, simply could not serve both the front and the civilian population. Grain spoiled in rural depots while urban families stood in lines that grew longer each week. Inflation turned daily survival into a struggle. Soldiers learned that the wages they sent home were now worth a fraction of what they had been before the war. Basic goods became luxuries, and essentials disappeared altogether. Boots, coats, and fuel were scarce, and families burned furniture to survive the winter. These were not abstract economic statistics. They were stories whispered in dugouts and read in trembling handwriting from home. Each letter reminded soldiers that their suffering at the front was not protecting their loved ones from hardship, it was, some ways, causing it. This realization cut deeply into the meaning of sacrifice. A soldier might endure danger if he believed his endurance shielded his family from hunger, but that belief was increasingly impossible to sustain. Men began to ask themselves why they were holding the line when their children were cold, their parents hungry, and their villages unraveling. The war had promised defense of the nation, yet the nation itself seemed to be slipping away. As unrest spread through the cities, news of strikes and demonstrations reached the front with alarming speed. Soldiers heard of crowds demanding bread, of factories standing still, of police powerless to restore order. These reports did not feel distant or political. They felt personal. Many of the protesters were wives, mothers, and sisters of men in uniform. The boundary between civilian suffering and military duty dissolved, and with it, the emotional distance that had allowed soldiers to keep fighting. Gradually, the army's sense of purpose eroded. Orders still arrived, and routines continued, but obedience became mechanical rather than heartfelt. When officers spoke of victory and endurance, their words rang hollow against the reality unfolding at home. The front was no longer a shield protecting society. It was a drain pulling everything into the same spiral of exhaustion. By the time political upheaval shook the capital, many soldiers had already reached a quiet conclusion. The greatest danger facing Russia was no longer just the enemy across the trenches, but the collapse of the world they had left behind. Fighting on began to feel less like duty and more like absence from families who needed them, from land that was being divided, and from a future that no longer waited patiently for the war to end. In this way, economic collapse did what years of brutal combat had failed to achieve. It did not break the army through force, but through understanding. Once soldiers truly grasped that their sacrifice no longer protected their families, the emotional foundation of the war crumbled. And when belief disappeared, the army's strength followed soon after. By the time unrest erupted in Petrograd in February 1917, the Russian army had already been weakened in ways that could not be repaired by weapons or reinforcements. The soldiers at the front carried with them not only the exhaustion of war, but the knowledge that the country behind them was unraveling. When demonstrations over bread and living conditions spread through the capital, the moment demanded a clear choice from the armed forces: defend the old order by force, or step aside and allow events to unfold. What followed was neither a dramatic uprising nor a coordinated mutiny, but something far more decisive: quiet acceptance. The garrison troops stationed in Petrograd were among the first to feel the pressure. These men were not hardened frontline veterans but reserve soldiers, many of whom had spent months drilling without being sent to the front, listening to rumors, reading newspapers, and absorbing the growing anger of the city. When orders came to suppress the protests, hesitation replaced obedience. Some units refused outright, others simply remained in their barracks. And soon soldiers began to mingle with the crowds rather than confront them. This shift did not come from a unified revolutionary ideology, but from a shared sense that the old rules no longer held meaning. Firing on civilians who looked like their own families felt impossible after years of sacrifice that had brought so little relief. What made this moment truly irreversible was the reaction of the army's highest leadership. Senior commanders, far from rallying to the Tsar's side, concluded that the monarchy had become a liability to the war effort. They feared that continued loyalty to Nicholas I would plunge the country into deeper chaos, making victory against the Central Powers impossible. When the Tsar sought support to restore order, it did not come. Instead, generals and staff officers quietly urged him to abdicate, believing that a new government might stabilize the situation and preserve the army's ability to fight. At the front, news of the abdication spread slowly and unevenly. Many soldiers learned of it days later, and their reaction was not celebration, but confusion. For years, loyalty to the Tsar had been presented as inseparable from duty to Russia itself. Now that link was severed, and no clear replacement had been offered. The soldiers did not suddenly become revolutionaries, most simply waited, uncertain of what obedience meant in a country that had transformed overnight. This uncertainty proved decisive. An army depends not only on orders, but on shared assumptions about authority and purpose. In February 1917, those assumptions dissolved. Soldiers no longer believed that the Tsar embodied the nation, and the new provisional government had yet to earn their trust. As a result, the army neither crushed the revolution nor fully embraced it. Instead, it allowed it to happen. The February Revolution succeeded not because the army rose against the monarchy in a single dramatic act, but because it withdrew the invisible support that had sustained the Tsarist system for centuries. Passivity, in this case, was power. Without soldiers willing to enforce his rule, Nicholas I stood isolated, and abdication became inevitable. This moment marked a turning point not only for Russia's political future, but for its army. By stepping aside, the military helped bring down the old regime. Yet in doing so it also loosened the final bonds of loyalty that held it together. The revolution was won without a decisive battle, but the cost was profound. The army emerged from February 1917 suspended between worlds, no longer anchored to the monarchy, not yet committed to the new republic, and increasingly unsure why it should continue to fight at all. After the February Revolution removed the Tsar and shattered the old symbols of authority, the Russian army entered a dangerous vacuum. Soldiers had accepted the fall of the monarchy with uncertainty rather than enthusiasm, but the structure that had governed their daily lives for generations still remained, at least for a brief moment. Then, almost overnight, that structure was altered in a way no army at war could easily survive. The turning point came with the issuance of what became known as Order No. 1. Born in the tense atmosphere of Petrograd in early March 1917. The order was intended to protect soldiers from abuse and to prevent reactionary officers from reversing the revolution. It reflected the fears and demands of politically active garrison troops rather than the realities of a vast army stretched across thousands of kilometers of front. Yet its reach extended far beyond the capital. As news of the order spread, it carried a powerful message. The old rules no longer applied. Order No. 1 transferred key elements of authority away from officers and placed them in the hands of soldiers' committees. Weapons were to be controlled collectively. Orders could be questioned, and the rigid social distance between officers and enlisted men was formally abolished. To soldiers who had endured years of hardship under a system they often experienced as harsh and distant, these changes felt like long overdue recognition of their dignity. Many welcomed the chance to speak, vote, and be heard for the first time in uniform. But what the order removed was clearer than what it replaced. The traditional hierarchy of command, already weakened by casualties and revolution, lost its remaining certainty. Officers no longer knew whether their orders would be followed, and soldiers no longer knew which authority truly mattered. In some units, this transition unfolded calmly, with committees attempting to balance discipline and fairness. In others, resentment boiled over. Officers associated with the old social order were dismissed, arrested. In rare but shocking cases, attacked by their own men. The deeper damage lay in the erosion of trust. For years, the relationship between officers and soldiers had been strained by class divisions and wartime suffering. Order No. 1 did not create this tension, but it magnified it. Soldiers increasingly saw officers as symbols of a failed past, while officers began to view their men as unpredictable and unreliable. Each side felt threatened by the other, and cooperation gave way to suspicion. At the front, where cohesion mattered most, the effects were subtle but devastating. Orders took longer to execute as discussions replaced immediate obedience. Discipline became conditional, dependent on agreement rather than duty. In moments of crisis, hesitation replaced reflex. The army still looked intact, but its inner mechanisms were grinding to a halt. Even the soldiers' committees, many of which supported the new republic and wished to keep fighting defensively, struggled to fill the void. They had authority, but not experience. They could debate, but not always decide. Most importantly, they could not restore the clarity that had once defined military command. An army, after all, cannot function on shared opinion alone when facing a determined enemy. Order No. 1 did not instantly destroy the Russian army, but it marked the point of no return. By dismantling the old system without offering a workable alternative, it left millions of men in uniform navigating uncertainty at the very moment when unity was most essential. The army continued to exist, continued to hold the line, and even continued to hope for stability. Yet beneath the surface, the bond that turned individuals into a fighting force had been irreparably weakened. In the months that followed, every crisis would deepen these fractures. Political debates, failed offensives, and growing unrest would all take their toll. But the decisive blow had already been struck. When authority became negotiable and trust collapsed, the Russian army's fate was no longer tied to the battlefield alone. It was tied to the slow, internal unraveling set in motion by Order No. 1. As the old hierarchy dissolved and the army struggled to redefine authority after Order No. 1, an even deeper uncertainty spread through the ranks. It was no longer just a question of who had the right to give orders, but why those orders should be obeyed at all. The war itself, once presented as a sacred duty to the Tsar and the motherland, had lost its clear meaning. In its place emerged a bitter and confusing argument that reached from the halls of government to the muddy trenches of the front. The provisional government insisted that Russia must remain in the war to protect the revolution and honor its commitments to its allies. In speeches and proclamations, the war was rebranded as a struggle for freedom rather than empire, a necessary sacrifice to defend the newborn republic against foreign domination. For many soldiers, this message sounded familiar yet hollow. They had already given years of their lives under earlier promises, and victory had remained distant. Changing the language of the war did not change the reality of exhaustion, loss, and uncertainty. At the same time, voices from the left offered a radically different interpretation. Socialist groups within the soldiers' committees argued that the army should fight only to defend Russian territory, not to pursue ambitious offensives. This idea of a purely defensive war resonated deeply. Most soldiers were not opposed to protecting their homes from invasion, but they saw little reason to risk their lives in attacks that seemed to serve political interests rather than immediate survival. The distinction mattered greatly. Defense felt like necessity, offense like betrayal. Into this fragile atmosphere stepped the Bolsheviks, whose message was simple, uncompromising, and easy to understand. They rejected the war altogether, portraying it as a conflict that benefited elites while ordinary people paid the price. Their slogans traveled quickly through reserve units, rear garrisons, and eventually the front itself. While not all soldiers embraced these ideas, the clarity of the message contrasted sharply with the hesitant and often contradictory statements of the government. In a time of confusion, certainty carried power. The impact was gradual rather than sudden. Units did not immediately lay down their arms, nor did the front collapse overnight. Instead, attitudes shifted. Soldiers listened more closely to debates within their committees, discussed politics in dugouts, and questioned the purpose of upcoming operations. Orders to hold defensive positions were generally accepted, because they aligned with the instinct to protect one another and survive. Orders to attack, however, were met with hesitation, debate, or silent refusal. This divide between defense and offense exposed a fundamental problem. An army can endure hardship if its members believe they are preventing something worse. But launching offensives requires confidence in leadership and faith in a larger goal. By mid-1917, that faith was gone. Each failed promise of progress reinforced the belief that further attacks would only bring more loss without meaningful gain. The government struggled to counter this shift. Attempts to suppress radical voices only deepened resentment, while efforts to inspire enthusiasm through speeches and symbolic gestures failed to address the underlying doubts. Soldiers no longer measured loyalty by words or slogans, but by whether decisions aligned with their lived experience. In that calculation, defending the line made sense. Advancing into enemy fire did not. As political divisions sharpened, the army became a reflection of the fractured society it came from. Competing visions of Russia's future clashed within the same units, turning shared hardship into disagreement rather than unity. The war, once a unifying national effort, became a contested question with no accepted answer. By the time calls for new offensives grew louder, most soldiers had already made a quiet choice. They would stand their ground if necessary, protect their comrades, and wait for events to unfold. But they would not willingly throw themselves into attacks that no longer felt justified. In that decision lay the final transformation of the Russian army. Still present, still armed, but no longer committed to the kind of war its leaders hoped to fight. The collapse that followed the July 1917 offensive was not sudden, but when it came, it felt final. The attack, promoted as a decisive effort to restore morale and prove that revolutionary Russia could still fight, instead exposed how deeply the army had already fractured. Units advanced without conviction. Officers issued orders that carried little authority, and soldiers moved forward knowing that belief in the mission was absent. When resistance stiffened and losses mounted, the fragile structure holding the army together gave way. Retreat quickly turned into disintegration. Soldiers did not simply fall back. Many abandoned the front entirely, convinced that further sacrifice served no meaningful purpose. Desertion spread along railways and roads as men returned to villages and cities already strained by shortages and unrest. Others stayed with their units but refused to obey commands, challenging officers openly or ignoring orders altogether. What had once been isolated acts of defiance became a shared response to a system that no longer inspired trust. The failed offensive destroyed the last hope that discipline could be restored through action. Instead of uniting the army, it confirmed the doubts that had been growing since the February Revolution. Soldiers now believed that political leaders were either disconnected from reality or willing to gamble lives for abstract goals. The idea of continuing the war lost whatever legitimacy it had left, and the army, still vast in numbers, ceased to function as a coherent fighting force. This breakdown reshaped the balance of power inside Russia. The provisional government depended on the army not only to fight abroad, but to maintain order at home. Once soldiers stopped obeying, that foundation disappeared. Attempts to reassert control only deepened resentment, while harsh measures risked pushing even more troops toward open resistance. Authority drained away, leaving a vacuum that others were ready to fill. The Bolsheviks understood this moment clearly. They did not need to defeat the army in battle, because the army was already defeating itself. Their promises of peace, land, and an end to suffering resonated with men who had endured years of hardship for causes that kept changing. By the autumn of 1917, large parts of the military were no longer defenders of the existing order, but passive observers, or even quiet supporters, of a radical alternative. Russia's withdrawal from the war was no longer a matter of strategy, but inevitability. An army unwilling to attack, unable to enforce discipline, and divided by politics could not sustain a modern conflict. The failure of the July offensive marked the point of no return, transforming exhaustion and doubt into irreversible collapse. When power shifted in October, it happened not against the army, but through its absence as a decisive force. This was the true death of the Russian army of 1917, not destroyed by an enemy's fire, but undone by lost faith. Broken authority. and a war that no longer made sense to those asked to fight it. From that collapse emerged a new chapter in Russian history, shaped by promises of peace and the memory of a conflict that consumed an empire from within. Thank you for listening to this story. If you found it meaningful, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us for more deep explorations into history and the forces that change the world.